sorcery and sanctity, said Ambrose. These are the only realities. Each is an ecstasy, a withdrawal from the common life. Cotgrave listened interested. He had been brought by a friend to this mouldering house in a northern suburb, through an old garden to the room where Ambrose the recluse dozed and dreamed over his books. Yes, he went on, magic is justified of her children. There are many, I think, who eat dry crusts and drink water with a joy infinitely sharper than anything within the experience of the practical epicure. You are speaking of the saints? Yes, and the sinners too. I think you are falling into the very general error of confining the spiritual world to the supremely good, but the supremely wicked necessarily have their portion in it. The merely carnal, sensual man can no more be a great sinner than he can be a great saint. Most of us are just indifferent, mixed-up creatures. We muddle through the world without realizing the meaning and the inner sense of things, and consequently our wickedness and our goodness are alike second-rate, unimportant. And you think the great sinner, then, will be an ascetic as well as the great saint? Great people of all kinds forsake the imperfect copies and go to the perfect originals. I have no doubt but that many of the very highest among the saints have never done good action, using the words in their ordinary sense. And on the other hand, there have been those who have sounded the very depths of sin, who have all their lives never done an ill deed. He went out of the room for a moment, and Cotgrave, in high delight, turned to his friend and thanked him for the introduction. "He's grand," he said. "I never saw the kind of lunatic before." Ambrose returned with more whiskey and held the two men in a liberal manner. He abused the teetotal sect with ferocity, and handed the seltzer, and pouring out a glass of water for himself, was about to resume his monologue when Cotgrave broke in. "I can't stand it, you know," said. "Your paradoxes are too monstrous. A man may be a great sinner, and yet never do anything sinful. Come." "You're quite wrong," said Ambrose. "I never make paradoxes. I wish I could. I merely said that a man may have an exquisite taste in Romani Conti, and yet never have even smelt for ale. That's all, and it's more like a truism than a paradox, isn't it? Your surprise at my remark is due to the fact that you haven't realized what sin is. Oh yes, there is a sort of connection between sin with the capital letter and the actions which are commonly called sinful, with murder, theft, adultery, and so forth, much the same connection that there is between the A, B, and C and fine literature, but I believe the misconception, it is all but universal, arises in great measure from our looking at the matter through social spectacles. We think that a man who does evil to us and to his neighbors must be very evil. So he is from a social standpoint, but can't you realize that evil in its essence is a lonely thing, a passion of the solitary individual soul? Really, the average murderer, qua murderer, is not by any means a sinner in the true sense of the word. He is simply a wild beast that we have to get rid of to save our own necks from his knife. I should class him rather with tigers than with sinners. I think not. The murderer murders not from positive qualities, but from negative ones. He lacks something which non-murderers possess. Evil, of course, is wholly positive, only it is on the wrong side. You may believe me that sin in its proper sense is very rare. It is probable that there have been far fewer sinners than saints. Yes, your standpoint is all very well for practical social purposes. We are naturally inclined to think that the person who is very disagreeable to us must be a very great sinner. It is very disagreeable to have one's pocket picked, and we pronounce the thief to be a very great sinner. In truth, he is merely an undeveloped man. He cannot be a saint, of course, but he may be, and often is, an infinitely better creature than thousands who have never broken a single commandment. He is a great nuisance to us, I admit, and we very properly lock him up if we catch him. But between his troublesome and unsocial action and evil, oh, the connection is of the weakest. It was getting very late. The man who had brought Congreve had probably heard all this before, since he assisted with a bland and judicious smile, but Cotgrave began to think that his lunatic was turning into a sage. "Do you know," he said, "you interest me immensely. You think, then, that we do not understand the real nature of evil?" "No, I don't think we do. We overestimate it, and we underestimate it. We take the very numerous infractions of our social bylaws and the very necessary and very proper regulations which keep the human company together, and we get frightened at the prevalence of sin and evil. But this is really nonsense. Take theft, for example. Have you ever any horror at the thought of Robin Hood or the Highland caterans of the 17th century, of the moss troopers of the company promoters of our day? Then, on the other hand, we underrate evil. We attach such an enormous importance to the sin of meddling with our pockets and our wives that we have quite forgotten the awfulness of real sin. "And what is sin?" said Cotgrave. "I think I must reply to your question by another. What would your feelings be, seriously, if your cat or dog began to talk to you and to dispute with you in human accents? You would be overwhelmed with horror, I'm sure of it. And if the roses in your garden sang a weird song, you would go mad. And suppose the stones in the road began to swell and grow before your eyes, and if the pebble that you noticed at night had shot out stony blossoms in the morning, well, these examples may give you some notion of what sin really is." "Look here," said the third man, hitherto placid, "you two seem to be pretty well wound up. But I'm going home. I've missed my train, and I shall have to walk." Ambrose and Cotgrave seemed to settle down more profoundly when the other had gone out into the early misty morning and the pale light of the lamps. "You astonish me," said Cotgrave. "I had never thought of that. If that is really so, one must turn everything upside down. Then the essence of sin really is in the taking of heaven by storm, it seems to me," said Ambrose. "It appears to me that it is simply an attempt to penetrate into another and higher sphere. in a forbidden manner. You can understand why it is so rare. There are few indeed who wish to penetrate into other spheres, higher or lower, in ways allowed or forbidden. Men in the mass are amply content with life as they find it. Therefore, there are few saints and few sinners in the proper sense. Of fewer still, and men of genius who partake sometimes of each character are rare also. Yes, on the whole, it is perhaps harder to be a great sinner than a great saint. There is something profoundly unnatural about sin. Is that what you mean? Exactly. Holiness requires a great or almost as great an effort, but holiness works on lines that were natural ones. It is an effort to recover the ecstasy that was before the fall, but sin is an effort to gain the ecstasy and the knowledge that pertain alone to angels, and in making this effort man becomes a demon. I told you that the mere murderer is therefore not a sinner, that it is true, but the sinner is sometimes a murderer. Gilderay is an instance. So you see that while the good and the evil are unnatural to man, as how he now is to man, the social civilized being, evil is unnatural in a much deeper sense than good. The saint endeavors to recover a gift which he has lost. The sinner tries to obtain something which was never his. In brief, he repeats the fall. "But are you a Catholic?" said Cotgrave. "Yes, I am a member of the persecuted Anglican Church." "Then how about those texts which you seem to reckon a sin, that which you would set down as a mere trivial dereliction?" "Yes, but in one place the word sorcerers come in the same sentence, doesn't it? That seems to me to give the key note. Consider, can you imagine for a moment that a false statement which saves an innocent man's life is a sin? No, very good then. It is not the mere liar who is excluded by those words. It is above all the sorcerers who use the material life, who use the failings incidental to material life as instruments to obtain their infinitely wicked ends. And let me tell you this, our higher senses are so blunted, we are so drenched with materialism, that we should probably fail to recognize the real wickedness if we encountered it. But shouldn't we experience a certain horror, a terror, such as you hinted we would experience if a rose tree sang in the mere presence of an evil man? We should, if we were natural. Children and women feel this horror you speak of. Even animals experience it. But with most of us, convention and civilization and education have blinded and deafened and obscured the natural reason. No, sometimes we may recognize evil by its hatred of the good. One doesn't need much penetration to guess at the influence which dictated quite unconsciously the Blackwood Review of Keats. But this is purely incidental, and as a rule I suspect that the hierarchs of Tophet was pass quite unnoticed, or perhaps in certain cases as good, but mistaken men. But you used the word unconscious just now of Keats' reviewers. Is wickedness ever unconscious? Always. It must be so. It is like holiness and genius in this as in other aspects. It is a certain rapture or ecstasy of the soul. a transcendent effort to surpass the ordinary bounds. So surpassing these, it surpasses also the understanding, the faculty that takes note of that which comes before it. No, a man may be infinitely and horribly wicked and never suspect it. But I tell you, evil in this its certain and true sense is rare, and I think it is growing rarer. I'm trying to get a hold of it all, said Cotgrave. From what you say, I gather that true evil differs generically from which we call evil. Quite so. There is no doubt an analogy between the two, a resemblance such as enables us to use quite legitimately such terms as the foot of the mountain and the leg of the table, and sometimes, of course, the two speak, as it were, in the same language, the rough miner or puddler, the untrained, undeveloped tiger man, heated by a quart or two above his usual measure, comes home and kicks his irritating and injudicious wife to death. He is a murderer, and Gilderay was a murderer, but you see the gulf that separates the two. The word, if I may so speak, is accidentally the same in each case, but the meaning is utterly different. It is flagrant Hobson Jobson to confuse the two, or rather it is as if one supposed that the Juggernaut and the Argonauts had something to do etymologically with one another, and no doubt the same weak likeness or analogy runs between all the social sins and the real spiritual sins, and in some cases perhaps the lesser may be schoolmasters to lead one on to the greater, from the shadow to the reality. If you are anything of a theologian, you will see the importance of all this. "I'm sorry to say," remarked Cotgrave, "that I have devoted very little of my time to theology. Indeed, I have often wondered on what grounds theologians have claimed the title of science of sciences for their favorite study, since the theological books I have looked into have always seemed to me to be concerned with feeble and obvious pieties, or with kings of Israel and Judah. I do not care to hear about those kings." Ambrose grinned. "We must try to avoid the theological discussion," he said. "I perceive that you would be a bitter disputant, but perhaps the dates of the kings have as much to do with the theology as the hobnails of the murderous puddler with evil." "Yes, it is the infernal miracle, as holiness is supernal. Now and then it is raised to such a pitch that we entirely fail to suspect its existence. It is like the note of the great pedal pipes of the organ, which is so deep that we cannot hear it. In other cases it may lead to the lunatic asylum or still stranger issues, but you must never confuse it with mere social misdoing. Remember how the Apostle, speaking of the other side, distinguishes between charitable actions and charity, as one may give all one's goods to the poor and yet lack charity. So remember, one may avoid every crime and yet be a sinner. "Your psychology is very strange to me," said Cotgrave, "but I confess I like it, and I suppose that one might fairly deduce from your premises the conclusion that the real sinner might very possibly strike the observer as a harmless personage enough. Certainly, because the true evil has nothing to do with social life or social laws, for it has only incidentally and accidentally. It is a lonely passion of the soul, or a passion of the lonely soul, whichever you like. If by chance we understand it and grasp its full significance, then indeed it will fill us with horror and with awe. But this emotion is widely distinguished from the fear and the disgust which we regard the ordinary criminal, since this latter is largely or entirely founded on the regard which we have for our own skins or purses. We hate a murder because we know that we should hate to be murdered, or to have anyone that we like murdered. So on the other side, we venerate the saints, but we don't like them as well as our friends. Can you persuade yourselves that you would have enjoyed St. Paul's company? Do you think that you and I would have got on with Sir Galahad? So with the sinners as with the saints, if you met a very evil man and recognized his evil, he would no doubt fill you with horror and awe, but there is no reason why you should dislike him. On the contrary, it is quite possible that if you succeed in putting the sin out of your mind, you might find the sinner capital company, and in a little while you might have to reason yourself back into horror. Still, how awful it is if the roses and the lilies suddenly sang on this coming morning, if the furniture began to move in the procession as in de Maupassant's tale. "I'm glad you have come back to that comparison," said Cotgrave, "because I wanted to ask you what it is that corresponds in humanity to these imaginary feats of inanimate things. In a word, what is sin? You have given me, I know, an abstract definition, but I should like a concrete example." "I told you it was very rare," said Ambrose, who have appeared willing to avoid the giving of a direct answer. "The materialism of the age, which has done a good deal to suppress sanctity, has done perhaps more to suppress evil. We find the earth so very comfortable that we have no inclination either for ascents or descents. It would seem as if the scholar who deciphered and decided to specialize in Tophet would be reduced to purely antiquarian researches. No paleontologist could show you a live pterodactyl. And yet you, I think, have specialized, and I believe that your researches have descended into our modern times. You are really interested, I see. Well, I confess that I have dabbled a little, and if you like, I can show you something that bears on the very curious subject we have been discussing." Ambrose took a candle and went away to a far dim corner of the room. Cotgrave saw him open a venerable bureau that stood there, and from some secret recess he drew out a puzzle and came back to the window where they had been sitting. Ambrose undid a wrapping of paper and produced a green pocket-book. "You will take care of it," he said. "Don't leave it lying about. It is one of the choicer pieces in my collection, and I should be very sorry if it were lost." He fondled the faded binding. "I knew a girl who wrote this," he said. "When you read it, you will see how it illustrates the talk we have had tonight. There is a sequel too, but I won't talk of that." There was an odd article in one of the reviews some months ago. He began again with the air of a man who changes the subject. It was written by a doctor, Dr. Corin, I think was the name. He says that a lady watching her little girl playing at the drawing room window suddenly saw the heavy sash give way and fall on the child's fingers. The lady fainted, I think, but at any rate the doctor was summoned, and when he had dressed the child's wounded and maimed fingers, he was summoned to the mother. She was groaning with pain, and it was found that 3 fingers of her hand, corresponding with those that had been injured on the child's hand, were swollen and inflamed, and later, in the doctor's language, purulent sloughing set in. Ambrose still handed delicately the green volume. "Well, here it is," he said, parting with difficulty. "It seems from his treasure. You will bring it back as soon as you have read it," he said, as they went out into the hall, into the old garden, faint with the odor of white lilies. There was a broad red band in the east as Cotgrave turned to go, and from the high ground where he stood he saw that awful spectacle of London in a dream. The green book. The morocco binding of the book was faded, and the collar had grown faint, but there were no stains nor bruises nor marks of usage. The book looked as if it had been bought on a visit to London some 70 or 80 years ago, and had somehow been forgotten and suffered to lie away out of sight. There was an old, delicate, lingering odor about it, such an odor as sometimes haunts an ancient piece of furniture for a century or more. The end papers inside the binding were oddly decorated with colored patterns and faded gold. It looked small, but the paper was fine, and there were many leaves closely covered with minute, painfully formed characters. "I found this book," the manuscript began, "in a drawer in the old bureau that stands on the landing. It was a very rainy day, and I could not go out, so in the afternoon I got a candle and rummaged in the bureau. Nearly all the drawers were full of old dresses, but one of the small ones looked empty, and I found this book hidden right at the back. I wanted a book like this, so I took it to write in. It is full of secrets. I have a great many other books of secrets I have written, hidden in a safe place, and I am going to write here many of the old secrets and some new ones, but there are some I shall not put down at all. I must not write down the real names of the days and months which I found out a year ago, nor the way to make the Aklo letters, or the Chian language, or the great beautiful circles, nor the Mao games, nor the chief songs. I may write something about all these things, but not the way to do them for peculiar reasons, and I must not say who the nymphs are, or the dolls, or Gilo, or what Vulas mean. All these are most secrets, and I am glad when I remember what they are, and how many wonderful languages I know, but there are some things I call the secrets of the secrets that I dare not think of unless I am quite alone. And then I shut my eyes and put my hands over them and whisper the word, and the Alala comes. I only do this at night in my room or in certain woods that I know, but I must not describe them as they are secret words. Then there are the ceremonies, which are all of them important, but some are more delightful than others. There are the white ceremonies, and the green ceremonies, and the scarlet ceremonies. The scarlet ceremonies are the best, but there is only one place where they can be performed properly. Though there is a very nice imitation which I have done in other places. Besides these, I have the dances and the comedy, and I have done the comedy sometimes when the others were looking and they didn't understand anything about it. I was very little when I first knew about these things. When I was very small and mother was alive, I can remember remembering things before that, only it has all got confused. But I remember when I was 5 or 6, I heard them talking about me when they thought I was not noticing. They were saying how queer I was a year or two before, and how nurse had called my mother to come and listen to me talking all to myself. And I was saying words that nobody could understand. I was speaking the shoe language, but I only remember a very few words, as it was about the little white faces that used to look at me when I was lying in my cradle. They used to talk to me, and I learned their language and talked to them in it about some great white place where they lived, where the trees and the grass were all white, and there were white hills as high up as the moon and the cold wind. I have often dreamed of it afterwards, but the faces went away when I was very little. But a wonderful thing happened when I was about 5. My nurse was carrying me on her shoulder. There was a field of yellow corn, and we went through it. It was very hot. Then we came to a path through a wood, and a tall man came after us and went with us till we came to a place where there was a deep pool, and it was very dark and shady. Nurse put me down on the soft moss under a tree, and she said she can't get to the pond now. So they left me there, and I sat quite still and watched, and out of the water and out of the wood came 2 wonderful white people, and they began to play and dance and sing. They were a kind of creamy white, like the old ivory figure in the drawing room. One was a beautiful lady with kind dark eyes and a grave face and long black hair, and she smiled such a strange, sad smile at the other, who laughed and came to her. They played together and danced round and round the pool, and they sang a song that till I fell asleep. Nurse woke me up when she came back, and she was looking something like the lady had looked, so I told her about it all, and asked her why she looked like that. At first she cried, and then she looked very frightened, and turned quite pale. She put me down on the grass and stared at me, and I could see that she was shaking all over. Then she said I had been dreaming, but I knew I hadn't. Then she made me promise not to say a word about it to anybody, and if I did, I should be thrown into the black pit. I was not frightened at all, though nurse was, and I never forgot about it, because when I shut my eyes, and it was quite quiet, and I was all alone, I could see them again, very faint and far away, but very splendid, and little bits of the song they sang came into my head, but I couldn't sing it. I was 13, nearly 14, when I had a very singular adventure, so strange that the day on which it happened is always called the White Day. My mother had been dead for more than a year, and in the morning I had lessons, but they let me go out for walks in the afternoon, and this afternoon I walked a new way, and a little brook led me into a new country, but I tore my frock getting through some of the difficult places. As the way was through many bushes, and beneath the low branches of trees, and up thorny thickets on hills, and by dark woods full of creeping thorns, and it was a long, long way, it seemed, as if I was going on for ever and ever, and I had to creep by a place like a tunnel where a brook must have been, but all the water had dried up, and the floor was rocky, and the bushes had grown overhead till they met, so that it was quite dark. And I went on and on through that dark place. It was a long, long way, and I came to a hill that I never saw before. I was in a dismal thicket full of black twisted boughs that tore me as I went through them, and I cried out because I was smarting all over. And then I found that I was climbing, and went up and up a long way, till at last the thicket stopped, and I came out crying just under the top of a big bare place, where there were ugly grey stones lying all about on the grass, and here and there a little twisted stunted tree came out from under a stone like a snake, and I went up right to the top a long way. I never saw such big ugly stones before. They came out of the earth, some of them, and some looked as if they had been rolled to where they were, and they went on and on as far as I could see, a long, long way. I looked out from them and saw the country, but it was strange. It was winter time, and there were black, terrible woods hanging from the hills all round. It was like seeing a large room hung with black curtains, and the shape of the trees seemed quite different from any I had ever seen before. I was afraid. Then beyond the woods there were other hills round in a great ring, but I had never seen any of them. It all looked black, and everything had a vor over it. It was all so still and silent, and the sky was heavy and grey and sad, like a wicked, wicked Moorish dome in a deep dender. I went on into the dreadful rocks. There were hundreds and hundreds of them. Some were like horrid grinning men. I could see their faces, as if they would jump out at me out of the stone, and catch hold of me and drag me with them back into the rock, so that I should always be there. And there were other rocks that were like animals, creeping, horrible animals, putting out their tongues, and others were like words that I could not say, and others like dead people lying on the grass. I went on among them, though they frightened me, and my heart was full of wicked songs that they put into it. And I wanted to make faces and twist myself about in the way they did, and I went on and on a long way, till at last I liked the rocks, and they didn't frighten me any more. I sang the songs I thought of, songs full of words that I must not be spoken or written down. Then I made faces like the faces on the rocks, and I twisted myself about like the twisted ones, and I lay down flat on the ground like the dead ones. And I went up to one that was grinning, and put my arms round him and hugged him, and so I went on and on through the rocks till I came to a round mound in the middle of them. It was higher than a mound. It was nearly as high as our house, and it was like a great basin turned upside down, all smooth and round and green, with one top stone like a post sticking up at the top. I climbed up the sides, but they were so steep I had to stop, or I should have rolled all the way down again, and I should have knocked against the stones at the bottom and perhaps been killed. but I wanted to get up to the very top of the big round mound, so I lay down flat on my face and took hold of all the grass with my hands, and drew myself up bit by bit till I was at the top. Then I sat down on the stone in the middle and looked all around about. I felt I had come such a long, long way, just as if I were 100 miles from home, or in some other country, or in one of the strange places I had read about in the tales of the genie and the Arabian Nights, or as if I had gone across the sea far away for years and had found another world that nobody had ever seen or heard of before, or as if I had somehow flown through the sky and fallen on one of the stars I had read about, where everything is dead and cold and grey, and there is no air and the wind doesn't blow. I sat on the stone and looked all around and down and round about me. It was just as if I was sitting on a tower in the middle of a great empty town, because I could see nothing all around but the grey rocks on the ground. I couldn't make out their shapes any more, but I could see them on and on for a long way, and I looked at them, and they seemed as if they had been arranged into patterns and shapes and figures. I knew they couldn't be, because I had seen a lot of them coming right out of the earth, joined to the deep rocks below. So I looked again, but still I saw nothing but circles and small circles inside big ones, and pyramids and domes and spires, and they seemed all to go round and round the place where I was sitting. And the more I looked, the more I saw great big rings of rocks getting bigger and bigger, and I stared so long that it felt as if they were all moving and turning like a great wheel. And I was turning too in the middle. I got quite dizzy and queer in the head, and everything began to be hazy and not clear. I saw little sparks of blue light, and the stones looked as if they were springing and dancing and twisting as they went round and round and round. I was frightened again, and I cried out loud and jumped up from the stone I was sitting on and fell down. When I got up, I was so glad they all looked still, and I sat down on the top and slid down the mound and went on again. I danced as I went in the peculiar way the rocks had danced when I got giddy, and I was so glad I could do it quite well, and I danced and danced along and sang extraordinary songs that came into my head. At last I came to the edge of that great flat hill, and there were no more rocks, and the way went again through a dark thicket in a hollow. It was just as bad as the other one I went through climbing up, but I didn't mind this one, because I was so glad I had seen those singular dances and could imitate them. I went down, creeping through the bushes, and a tall nettle stung me on my leg and made me burn, but I didn't mind it, and I tingled with the boughs and the thorns, but I only laughed and sang. Then I got out of the thicket into a close valley, a little secret place, like a dark passage that nobody ever knows of, because it was so narrow and deep in the woods were so thick around it. There is a steep bank with trees hanging over it, and there the ferns keep green all through the winter. When they are dead and brown upon the hill, and the ferns there have a sweet rich smell, what oozes out of fir trees. There was a little stream of water running down this valley, so small that I could easily step across it. I drank the water with my hand, and it tasted like bright yellow wine, and it sparkled and bubbled as it ran down the beautiful red and yellow and green stones, so that it seemed alive and all colors at once. I drank it, and I drank more with my hand, but I couldn't drink enough, so I lay down and bent my head and sucked the water up with my lips. It tasted much better drinking it that way, and a ripple would come up to my mouth and give me a kiss. And I laughed and drank again, and pretended there was a nymph like the one in the old picture at home, who lived in the water and was kissing me. So I bent down to the water and put my lips softly to it and whispered to the nymph that I would come again. I felt sure it could not be common water. I was so glad when I got up and went on. I danced again and went up and up to the valley under the hanging hills, and when I came to the top, the ground rose up in front of me, tall and steep as a wall, and there was nothing but the green wall and the sky. I thought of a forever and forever world without end. Amen. And I thought I must have really found the end of the world, because it was like the end of everything, as there could be nothing at all beyond except the kingdom of war, where light goes when it is put out, and the water goes when the sun takes it away. I began to think of all the long, long way I had journeyed, how I had found a brook and followed it on, and gone through bushes and thorny thickets and dark woods full of creeping thorns. Then I had crept up a tunnel under trees, and climbed a thicket, and seen all the grey rocks, and sat in the middle of them when they turned round, and then I had gone on through the grey rocks, and come down the hill through the stinging thicket, and up the dark valley, all a long, long way. I wondered how I should get home again, if I could ever find the way, and if my home was there any more, or if it were turned and everybody into grey rocks, as in the Arabian Nights. So I sat down on the grass and thought what I should do next. I was tired, and my feet were hot with walking, and as I looked about, I saw there was a wonderful well just under the high, steep wall of grass. All the ground round it was covered with bright green dripping moss. There was every kind of moss there, moss like beautiful little ferns, and like palms and fir trees. And it was all green as jewelry, and drops of water hung on it like diamonds, and in the middle was the great well, deep and shining and beautiful, so clear that it looked as if I could touch the red sand at the bottom, but it was far below. I stood by it and looked in, as if I were looking in a glass. At the bottom of the well, in the middle of it, the red grains of sand were moving and stirring all the time, and I saw how the water bubbled up, but all the top of it was quite smooth and full and brimming. It was a great well, large like a bath, and with a shining, glittering green moss about it. It looked like a great white jewel, with green jewels all around. My feet were so hot and tired that I took off my boots and stockings and let my feet down into the water, and the water was soft and cold, and when I got up I wasn't tired any more, and I felt I must go on farther and farther and see what was on the other side of the wall. I climbed up it very slowly, going sideways all the time, and when I got to the top and looked over, I was in the queerest country I had seen, stranger even than the hill of the grey rocks. It looked as if earth children had been playing there with their spades, as it was all hills and hollows and castle and walls made of earth and covered with grass. There were two mounds like big beehives, round and great and solemn, and then hollow basins, and then a steep mounting wall like the ones I saw once by the seaside where the big guns and the soldiers were. I nearly fell into one of the round hollows. It went away from under my feet so suddenly, and I ran fast down the side and stood at the bottom and looked up. It was strange and solemn to look up. There was nothing but the grey heavy sky and the sides of the hollow. Everything else had gone away, and the hollow was the whole world, and I thought that at night it must be full of ghosts and moving shadows and pale things when the moon shone down to the bottom of the dead of the night, and the wind wailed up above. It was so strange and solemn and lonely, like a hollow temple of dead heathen gods. It reminded me of a tale my nurse had told me when I was quite little. It was the same nurse that took me into the wood where I saw the beautiful white people. And I remembered how nurse had told me the story one winter night when the wind was beating the trees against the wall and crying and moaning in the nursery chimney. She said there was something, or somewhere or other, a hollow pit, just like the one I was standing in. Everybody was afraid to go into it or near it. It was such a bad place. But once upon a time, there was a poor girl who said she would go into the hollow pit. And everybody tried to stop her, but she would go. And she went down into the pit and came back laughing and said there was nothing there at all except green grass and red stones and white stones and yellow flowers. And soon after, people saw she had most beautiful emerald earrings, and they asked how she got them. And she and her mother were quite poor, but she laughed and said her earrings were not made of emeralds at all, but only of green grass. Then one day she wore on her breast the reddest ruby that anyone had ever seen. It was as big as a hen's egg and glowed and sparkled like a hot burning coal of fire. And they asked how she got it, as she and her mother were quite poor. But she laughed and said it was not a ruby at all, but only a red stone. Then one day she wore around her neck the loveliest necklace that anyone had ever seen, much finer than the queen's finest, and it was made of a great diamonds, bright, hundreds of them, and they shone like all the stars on a night in June. So they asked her how she got it, and she and her mother were quite poor, but she laughed and said that they were not diamonds at all, but only white stones. And one day she went to the court, and she wore on her head a crown of pure angel gold. So nurse said that it shone like the sun, and it was much more splendid than the crown the king was wearing himself, and in her ears he wore the emeralds, and the big ruby was the brooch on her breast, and the great diamond necklace was sparkling on her neck. And the king and queen thought she was some great princess from a long way off, and got down from their thrones and went to meet her. But somebody told the king and queen who she was, and that she was quite poor. So the king asked her why she wore a gold crown and how she got it, as she and her mother were so poor. And she laughed and said it wasn't a gold crown at all, but only some yellow flowers she had put in her hair. And the king thought it was very strange, and said she should stay at the court, and they would see what could happen next. and she was so lovely that everybody said that her eyes were greener than the emeralds, that her lips were redder than the ruby, that her skin was whiter than the diamonds, and that her hair was brighter than the golden crown. So the king's son said he would marry her, and the king said he might. And the bishop married them, and there was a great supper. And afterwards the king's son went to his wife's room, but just when he had his hand on the door, he saw a tall black man with a dreadful face standing in front of the door, and a voice that said, "Venture not upon your life, this is mine own wedded wife." Then the king's son fell down on the ground in a fit, and they came and tried to get into the room, but they couldn't, and they hacked at the door with hatchets, but the wood had turned hard as iron, and at last everybody ran away. They were so frightened at the screaming and laughing and shrieking and crying that came out of the room. But the next day they went in and found there was nothing in the room but thick black smoke, because the black man had come and taken her away. And on the bed there were 2 knots of faded grass, and a red stone, and some white stones, and some faded yellow flowers. I remembered this tale of nurses while I was standing at the bottom of the deep hollow. It was so strange and solitary there, and I felt afraid. I could not see any stones or flowers, but I was afraid of bringing them away without knowing, and I thought I would do a charm that came into my head to keep the black man away. So I stood right in the very middle of the hollow and made sure that I had none of those things on me, and then I walked round the place and touched my eyes and my lips and my hair in a peculiar manner, and whispered some queer words that nurse taught me to keep bad things away. Then I felt safe and climbed up out of the hollow and went on through all those mounds and hollows and walls, till I came to the end, which was high above all the rest, and I could see that all the different shapes of the earth were arranged in patterns, something like the grey rocks, and only the pattern was different. It was getting late, and the air was indistinct, but it looked from where I was standing something like 2 great figures of people lying on the grass. And I went on, and at last I found a certain wood, which is too secret to be described, and nobody knows of the passage into it, which I found out in a very curious manner by seeing some little animal run into the wood through it. So I went after the animal by a very narrow, dark way under thorns and bushes, and it was almost dark when I came to a kind of open place in the middle, and there I saw the most wonderful sight I have ever seen. But this was only for a minute, as I ran away directly and crept out of the wood by the passage I had come by, and ran as fast as I ever could, because I was afraid what I had seen was so wonderful and so strange and beautiful, but I wanted to get home and think of it. And I did not know what might not happen if I stayed by the wood. It was hot all over and trembling, and my heart was beating, and strange cries that I could not help came from me as I ran from the wood. I was glad that the great white moon came up from over a round hill and showed me the way. So I went back through the mounds and hollows, and down the close valley, and up through the thicket, and over the place of the grey rocks, and so at last I got home again. My father was busy in his study, and the servants had not told about my not coming home, though they were frightened and wondered what they ought to do. So I told them I'd lost my way, but I did not let them find out the real way I had been. I went to bed and lay awake all through the night, thinking of what I had seen. When I came out of the narrow way, and it looked all shining through the air, though the air was dark, it seemed so certain, and all the way home I was quite sure that I had seen it, and I wanted to be alone in my room and be glad over it all to myself, and shut my eyes and pretend it was there, and do all the things I would have done if I had not been so afraid. But when I shut my eyes, the sight would not come, and I began to think about my adventure all over again. And I remembered how dusky and queer it was at the end, and I was afraid it must be all a mistake, because it seemed impossible it could happen. It seemed like one of Nurse's tales, which I didn't really believe in, though I was frightened at the bottom of the hollow. And the stories he told me when I was little came back. And I wondered whether it was really there, what I thought I had seen, or whether any of her tales could have happened a long time ago. It was so queer. I lay awake there in my room at the back of the house, and the moon was shining on the other side towards the river, so the bright light did not fall upon the wall, and the house was quite still. I had heard my father come upstairs, and just after the clock struck 12, and after the house was still and empty, as if there was nobody alive in it. And though it was all dark and indistinct in my room, a pale glimmering kind of light shone in through the white blind, and once I got up and looked out, and there was a great black shadow of the house covering the garden, looking like a prison where men hanged, and then beyond it was all white, and the wood shone with white-black gulfs between the trees. It was still and clear, and there were no clouds on the sky. I wanted to think of what I had seen, but I couldn't. But I began to think of all the tales that Nurse had told me so long ago, that I thought I had forgotten, but they all came back and mixed up with the thickets and the grey rocks and the hollows in the earth and the secret wood, till I hardly knew what was new and what was old, or whether it was not all dreaming. And then I remembered that hot summer afternoon so long ago, when Nurse left me by myself in the shade, and the white people came out of the water and out of the wood, and played and danced and sang. And I began to fancy that Nurse told me something like it before I saw them, only I couldn't recollect exactly what she told me. Then I wondered whether she had been the white lady as I remembered. She was just as white and beautiful, and had the same dark eyes and black hair, and sometimes she smiled and looked like a lady had looked when she was telling me some of her stories, beginning with once on a time, or in the time of the fairies. But I thought she couldn't be the lady, as she seemed to have gone a different way into the wood, and I didn't think the man who came after us could be the other, or I couldn't have seen that wonderful secret in the secret wood. I thought of the moon, but it was afterwards, when I was in the middle of the wild land, where the earth was made into the shape of great figures, and it was all walls and mysterious hollows and smooth round mounds, that I saw that the great white moon come up over a round hill. I was wondering about all these things, till at last I got quite frightened, because I was afraid something had happened to me. And I remembered Nurse's tale of the poor girl who went into the hollow pit and was carried away at last by the black man. I knew I had gone into a hollow pit too, and perhaps it was the same, and I had done something dreadful, so I did the charm over again, and touched my eyes and my lips and my hair in a peculiar manner, and said the old words from the fairy language, so that I might be sure I had not been carried away. I tried again to see the secret wood, to creep up the passage and to see what I had seen there, but somehow I couldn't, and I kept on thinking of nurse's stories. There was one I remembered about a young man who once upon a time went hunting, and all the day he and his hounds hunted everywhere, and they crossed the rivers and went into all the woods and went round the marshes, but they couldn't find anything at all. And they hunted all day till the sun sank down and began to set behind the mountain. And the young man was angry because he couldn't find anything, and he was going to turn back when, just as the sun touched the mountain, he saw come out of a break in front of him a beautiful white stag. And he cheered it to his hounds, but they whined and would not follow, and he cheered to his horse, but it shivered and stood stock still. And the young man jumped off the horse and left the hounds, and began to follow the white stag all alone. And soon it was quite dark, and the sky was black without a single star shining in it, and the stag went away into the darkness. And though the man had brought his gun with him, he never shot at the stag, because he wanted to catch it, and he was afraid he would lose it in the night. But he never lost it once, though the sky was so black and the air was so dark, and the stag went on till the young man didn't know a bit where he was. And they went through enormous woods, where the air was full of whispers, and a pale dead light came out from the rotten trunks that were lying on the ground. And just as the man thought he had lost the stag, he would see it all white and shining in front of him, and he would run fast to catch it. But the stag always ran faster, so he did not catch it. And they went through the enormous woods, and they swam across rivers, and they waded through black marshes, where the ground bubbled and the air was full of will-o'-the-wisps, and the stag fled away down into the rocky narrow valleys, where the air was like the smell of a vault, and the man went after it. And they went over the great mountains, and the man heard the wind come down from the sky, and the stag went on, and the man went after. At last the sun rose, and the young man found he was in a country that he had never seen before. It was a beautiful valley with a bright stream running through it, and a great big round hill in the middle. And the stag went down the valley towards the hill, and it seemed to be getting tired, and went slower and slower,